Between March 19, 1847, and September 14, 1853, 14 altar boys disappeared from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in rural Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. No bodies were found, and no one came forward with credible testimony. A fire destroyed the church records from those years, but left other documents intact. What made this case especially chilling was the pattern and the deliberate destruction of evidence. 3 weeks ago, renovation work at the Sacred Heart Municipal Building uncovered a lead-lined box hidden beneath the foundation. Inside were 127 pages of testimony, church correspondences, and photographs revealing that the disappearances were no random tragedies. They were part of a dark and systematic plot turning a house of God into a hunting ground. Survivors who broke their silence after 170 years described disturbing rituals disguised as prayer and manipulative psychological tactics that led parents to willingly hand over their children. Thank you everyone for watching the video. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel to watch the next interesting videos. These findings suggest that the horrors at St. Joseph's could be linked to similar incidents over decades. Tonight we will delve into the buried truth, hear sealed witness testimonies, and explore evidence suggesting that this dark history stretched far beyond one church. But first, a word for those brave enough to seek the truth, the ones who dare uncover the darkness that powerful institutions try to bury. If you're ready to explore what others fear, to hit subscribe and let me know where you're listening from in the comments. What happened at St. Joseph's began with Father Cornelius Ali, whose charm was as deep as his hunger for power. When he arrived in Sacred Heart in 1845, the community of Irish immigrants struggling in the wake of the potato famine welcomed him as their answer to their spiritual needs. Sacred Heart wasn't even a town, just a collection of homes gathered around St. Joseph's Church. The people weren't wealthy, working in coal mines and steel mills, but their faith was unshakable. Father Ali seemed like the perfect fit. At 38, he had the commanding presence that made people trust him, and his background in Boston and Baltimore gave him credibility. Soon, Ali transformed the church, introducing an altar boy program that captivated parents. The boys learned Latin theology and sacred rituals, and Ali's influence over them grew. They became spiritually devoted and looked up to him as a father figure. But what no one realized was that Ali was grooming his victims. His private lessons in the church basement were not just about faith, but a way to manipulate and control. In March 1847, during the feast of St. Joseph, 12-year-old Michael Flanagan, a dedicated altar boy, vanished after helping with the dawn mass. His mother grew concerned when he didn't return for breakfast, but by then Michael was already gone. Despite extensive searches, no trace of him was found. When Father Ali returned from a trip to Pittsburgh, he assured the community that he had been meeting with the bishop about expanding the altar boy program. He helped organize more search efforts, but the boy was never found. Ali then addressed the congregation, explaining that Michael had confessed to serious sins before his disappearance. Ali's explanation, accusing Michael of stealing communion wine and mocking sacred rituals, was a masterstroke, shifting the blame to the boy and discouraging further investigation. The community accepted this, unable to imagine that their trusted priest might be lying. However, Margaret O'Brien, the church cleaner, had noticed strange details that didn't add up. When Margaret arrived at the church to prepare for the feast day mass, she found Michael's prayer book abandoned on the sacristy floor, its cover stained with something dark and unfamiliar. The altar candles were melted down to stubs with wax patterns, suggesting they had been moved and rearranged throughout the night. The most unsettling discovery was the basement door, once locked by Father McKenna, now ajar. Margaret had been down there only once before, but the smell that came from the basement was unlike anything she had ever encountered. A mix of incense and something decayed made her stomach churn. When she shared her observations with Father O'Malley, his reaction was swift and cold. He chastised her for speculating about sacred spaces, warning her that such thoughts were sinful. His presence was intimidating, and Margaret, feeling cornered, quietly accepted his rebuke, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few months, she kept a journal of the unsettling details she observed at St. Joseph's. The search for Michael Flanagan officially ended after a week, but his parents continued to hold out hope. Father O'Malley set up a memorial fund in Michael's name, and life in Sacred Heart returned to its normal rhythm. But beneath the surface, seeds of doubt were sown. Michael's body had never left the church. He was hidden in a chamber beneath the basement floor, evidence of dark rituals buried with him, and Father O'Malley was already preparing to select his next victim. In the months following Michael's disappearance, Father O'Malley's sermons grew darker, focusing on themes of hidden sin and the need for absolute obedience to God's representatives. He spoke often about spiritual warfare, particularly the dangers to the altar boys, claiming that they faced temptations beyond what ordinary children could imagine. The altar boy program continued, but with new, more personal sessions often held in the church basement, which O'Malley had been transforming for advanced religious education. Parents noticed changes in their sons. Tommy Sullivan, the senior altar boy, seemed spiritually mature beyond his years, impressing even visiting priests. But Kathleen Murphy, whose son Danny had just joined the program, began to notice troubling signs. Danny, once talkative and cheerful, became withdrawn, speaking vaguely about his lessons and sacred mysteries he couldn't share. He also started losing weight, developed dark circles under his eyes, and exhibited a tremor when O'Malley's name was mentioned. When she asked Danny about it, he insisted he was fine, but his voice sounded hollow, as if he were sleepwalking. Something wasn't right, and Kathleen's maternal instincts told her the truth was more disturbing than she could imagine. Danny began exhibiting knowledge and behaviors far beyond his age. He spoke of Catholic history not taught at their parish school, casually referenced religious practices from other cultures, and used Latin phrases that Father O'Malley claimed were advanced prayers reserved for the most spiritually mature altar boys. When Kathleen asked Danny where he learned such things, he explained that Father O'Malley was teaching them about the true church, the one before modern corruptions diluted the faith. However, the most unsettling changes were the nightmares that soon began tormenting Danny. He would wake screaming about a dark place under the church and a man in the shadows who wasn't truly Father O'Malley. He described stone chambers lit by candles with different colored flames, chanting voices in unfamiliar languages and rituals that left him feeling empty, as though something precious had been taken away. Kathleen's worries deepened as she observed similar changes in other altar boys. Timothy Walsh had developed a stutter when discussing church duties, while Brian O'Connor, once energetic, now sat motionless, staring blankly. Even Patrick Donnelly, once eager to follow Father O'Malley into the priesthood, now flinched at his name. When Kathleen tried to talk to other mothers, she met resistance. Many dismissed her concerns, insisting that their sons were simply maturing spiritually and that Father O'Malley's judgment should be trusted. Some even claimed that questioning the altar boy program was dangerous, suggesting it could expose their children to demonic influence. Father O'Malley had carefully cultivated an atmosphere of shame and denial, explaining that the boys were undergoing advanced spiritual training that required secrecy. Parents who truly loved their children, he assured them, would respect these boundaries. He also framed any criticism of the program as an attack on the Catholic faith itself, which in their community was a defense against Protestant hostility. This pressure kept doubts buried and reinforced the idea that questioning the priest was a threat to their community's survival. On the feast of St. Joseph in 1848, exactly 1 year after Michael's disappearance, Tommy Sullivan vanished after being selected for a special overnight vigil. Father O'Malley presented a new explanation. Tommy had been chosen for a mission to the Western Territories, where his spiritual gifts were urgently needed. He produced official-looking documents that praised Tommy's spiritual development, reassuring the Sullivans that their son was serving a higher purpose. But Margaret O'Brien, still cleaning the church, noticed the same unsettling signs that preceded Michael's disappearance. The basement door was ajar, and the smell of incense mixed with something foul. Father O'Malley had paid special attention to Tommy, keeping him after services and speaking to him in hushed tones that seemed to captivate the boy. The following day, while cleaning the sacristy, Margaret found Tommy's small wooden cross, a gift from his grandfather, abandoned. She couldn't fathom Tommy leaving it behind, especially for a mission so important. When she brought this up to Father O'Malley, his reaction was swift and menacing. He claimed that Tommy had deliberately left the cross to maintain a spiritual connection to Sacred Heart, and any suggestion that the boy hadn't left willingly was not only wrong, but dangerous. O'Malley warned her that her questions might be signs of a spiritual problem, and suggested she confess her doubts before they spread any further. Margaret understood the threat questioning Father O'Malley could mean being branded as a troublemaker, or worse, having her faith questioned in a community where religious conformity was crucial for survival. She fell silent but continued observing the disturbing patterns around Father O'Malley. As 1848 turned to 1849, his influence over Sacred Heart deepened. He introduced new rituals claiming they were based on ancient Catholic practices approved by the Vatican. These included midnight masses for altar boys, extended fasting periods, and private confessions that left the boys physically drained and disoriented. Despite the strange nature of these practices, the community accepted them, seeing their boys develop remarkable knowledge of Catholic doctrine and spiritual maturity. Father O'Malley wasn't just selecting victims, he was manipulating the entire community. He turned their faith into a weapon, using it to blind them to the warning signs and silence their protective instincts. By the winter of 1850, 5 altar boys had disappeared, and even the most faithful parishioners couldn't ignore the growing pattern. Each disappearance followed a similar sequence: intensive private sessions with O'Malley, noticeable changes in the boys' behavior, and then a ceremony or vigil from which they never returned. Father O'Malley always presented these disappearances as part of a divine calling, reinforced with official-looking documents that praised the boys' spiritual gifts. But cracks began to appear. Sean O'Connor, whose son Liam had disappeared the previous autumn, began to drink heavily at the local tavern. He muttered about wrong Latin chants and strange sounds coming from the church at midnight. He had seen lights moving in the basement windows, and shadows that didn't match the number of people who should have been inside. Mary Gallagher, who lived near the church, also reported disturbing sights: figures in white robes moving through the cemetery at night, carrying bundles toward the old memorial where the founding families were buried. She heard children's voices crying out in ways that didn't sound like hurt children, but like lost souls calling for their mothers. These fragmented reports, dismissed as the ramblings of grief-stricken parents and sleep-deprived neighbors, began to form a pattern. James McKenna, the nephew of the previous priest, stumbled upon a journal that cast new light on Father O'Malley's arrival. The journal revealed that Father McKenna had grown suspicious of O'Malley before his death. The old priest had received a letter from Bishop Kendrick's office confirming O'Malley's assignment, but when he wrote to confirm, his inquiries went unanswered. O'Malley had made strange requests about the church basement and the history of the property. When McKenna mentioned the site's rumored history as a gathering place for German settlers practicing folk Christianity, O'Malley had shown intense interest rather than dismissing the superstition. The journal's final entry read, "There is something ancient stirring beneath our sacred ground, something that has been waiting for the right hand to awaken it. I fear I have been too weak to prevent what is coming, and I pray that God will forgive my failure to protect the innocent from the wolf I have allowed into our fold." Father McKenna had died that night, found in his garden, with no apparent cause of death, his expression one of profound resignation. Condition: the strange stutter that had appeared after his involvement with the altar boy program became even more severe after the boy attended another of Father O'Malley's private sessions. This only reinforced their suspicions. They also noticed other oddities, small, almost imperceptible changes in their children's behavior that they couldn't ignore. With each passing day, the fathers grew more convinced that something sinister was happening beneath the church. As the surveillance began, they witnessed more than they had ever anticipated. On several occasions, they saw figures in white robes moving through the cemetery under the cover of night, with their movements too erratic and unnatural to be explained away. There were whispers of strange chanting coming from the church, and through the cracks in the basement windows they glimpsed figures performing rituals that seemed to defy all logic. The flames of the candles burned in odd directions, and shadows shifted unnaturally, as if the air itself were being manipulated. The fathers' worst fears were confirmed when they finally saw something they couldn't ignore: their sons standing in the church basement, eyes glowing unnaturally in the dim candlelight, moving like marionettes, controlled by forces beyond their understanding. The boys no longer appeared to be themselves. They were pale, hollow-eyed, and unrecognizable. The sight of them speaking in unison and their strange, soulless movements sent chills through the father's bones. Patrick's warnings had been real, and Father O'Malley's eternal altar boys were no longer the innocent children they had once been. They had been transformed, changed by rituals that stripped them of their humanity. The fathers now had undeniable proof that the horrors they had suspected were real. The next step was clear, but it was also the most dangerous decision they would ever make. They would go to the church authorities in Pittsburgh with what they had discovered, exposing Father O'Malley's monstrous actions and the suffering he had inflicted on their children. Yet they knew the risks. O'Malley had deep connections within the church, and they feared that any attempt to expose him would only lead to their ruin. Still, they could no longer remain silent. As they prepared to confront the truth, they knew that the fallout from their actions would be immense. It wasn't just about their children's lives anymore, it was about the very soul of their community. They were willing to risk everything, their livelihoods, their homes, and their faith, to protect their children from a monster who had woven himself into the very fabric of Sacred Heart. It was a choice that would tear the community apart, but it was a choice they had to make. The truth had to come out no matter the cost. The events that followed were a blur of terror and adrenaline. James Donnelly, heart-pounding, stumbled back up the stone steps, knowing that every moment he delayed made his escape more dangerous. His eyes locked with those of his son Patrick, who had turned toward him, his expression blank but haunted. The twisted transformation was undeniable. Patrick had become one of them, caught in a cycle that stripped him of his humanity, now serving Father O'Malley in a way no father should ever witness. As James neared the top of the stairs, he glanced back toward the altar, where Father O'Malley stood, no longer the priest he had once known, but something ancient and inhuman, radiating a power that seemed to warp the very air around him. The chanting continued, now louder, rising to a fever pitch. With all the strength he could muster, James sprinted into the freezing night, gasping for breath, feeling the eyes of those transformed altar boys following his every move. When he reached the safety of the woods, his legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, shaking uncontrollably. The reality of what he had seen threatened to consume him. The following days were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Sean O'Connor and Michael Walsh, having witnessed similar horrors from their vantage points, joined James in the desperate need to understand what they had seen and find a way to stop it. But their options were few, and time was running out. They knew that exposing Father O'Malley and the truth behind the disappearances would not only tear apart their community, but likely destroy everything they had worked for in America. Their faith had been used against them, their children lost to something that defied reason and religious doctrine. The three fathers gathered once again, this time in secret, their faces etched with the terror of what they'd witnessed. They were no longer the simple, hard-working immigrants they once were. They had become witnesses to a nightmare so dark it threatened to consume everything they had believed in. O'Malley's grip on their community was undeniable, and it was clear that his influence stretched far beyond the walls of St. Joseph's Church. Each father knew what was at stake. If they acted too soon, they risked being branded as heretics or worse. But they also knew they couldn't let their children remain lost to whatever evil had infected Sacred Heart. The next move had to be precise, calculated. They couldn't just expose Father O'Malley. They needed to bring down the entire structure he had built, unravel the twisted web of faith he had woven around their lives. What they didn't yet understand was that Father O'Malley was ready for them, as prepared as he had been for every other challenge that had come his way. The battle for Sacred Heart was about to reach its breaking point, and the truth was darker than they could have ever imagined. The creature that had worn the form of Father Cornelius O'Malley struggled against the binding ritual, its monstrous form writhing and distorting as the spell forced it to relinquish its hold on its human disguise. As its last desperate attempt to reclaim control echoed through the church, it screeched in a chorus of voices that shattered the remaining windows, filling the space with an unnatural cacophony. The horrific transformation was visible to all of them. The skin turned translucent, veins pulsed unnaturally fast beneath the surface, and eyes began to sprout in places no human eyes should be. It was no longer the man they had trusted for years. It was something ancient, something evil beyond human comprehension. The altar boys, the children whose innocence had been stolen and distorted, convulsed on the ground as the malignant force controlling them was expelled. Two of them, including Patrick Donnelly, slowly began to regain consciousness, their screams echoing through the church like the wails of the truly lost. But for 5 of them, the expulsion came too late. Their bodies, still twitching, lay motionless with eyes staring vacantly upward, lives and souls irretrievably lost. Bishop Kendrick, his face pale and lined with exhaustion, knew the battle wasn't yet over. The horror of what they had uncovered was only beginning to set in. The demon, once disguised as Father O'Malley, thrashed against the binding, its voice a dissonant chorus of commands, threats, and curses in languages older than humanity. But the power that had held the church, the community, and the altar boys captive for so long was breaking. The creature's form twisted violently as the ritual reached its peak. Its human facade continued to disintegrate, revealing something that defied the laws of nature, something that belonged in the realms of nightmares. It howled in fury, a sound so pure and primal it shook the very foundations of St. Joseph's Church. As the final threads of its control unraveled, the demon's form collapsed in on itself, the remaining semblance of Father O'Malley crumbling away like ash. For the first time in years, the church fell silent. The battle had been won, but the cost was profound. Bishop Kendrick stood in the center of the ruined sanctuary, his heart heavy with sorrow. The community of Sacred Heart, once so devout and united, now lay broken. The families who had entrusted their children to Father O'Malley, to this dark force masquerading as a priest, would never be the same. The altar boys who had been saved would need years of healing, both physical and spiritual. And for those who had perished, the light of their innocence was forever extinguished. James Donnelly, who had witnessed the horrific events unfold, stood trembling at the back of the church, his heart torn between relief and grief. His son Patrick was alive, but the boy he had known was gone. He had returned, but so much of him had been lost in the darkness that had consumed him. As the sun began to rise outside, casting light on the ruins of a once sacred place, Bishop Kendrick addressed the shaken survivors. There would be much to do, prayers for the dead, healing for the living, and an investigation that would extend far beyond the walls of Sacred Heart. But for now, the nightmare had ended. The truth had come to light. The community was free, but the scars of their ordeal would never fade. The darkness had been driven out, but its lingering presence would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The evil that had infected St. Joseph's Church, that had masqueraded as a man of God, would be remembered as a warning, one that would never be forgotten. And as they left the church one by one, their steps heavy with sorrow and disbelief, they knew that the battle against such darkness was never truly over. There would always be shadows lurking in the corners of their lives, waiting to consume the innocent once more. The discovery of those 14 sets of small bones beneath the basement floor of the old church was the final chilling confirmation that the horror at St. Joseph's Church had left a deeper, more sinister legacy than anyone had ever imagined. The workers who uncovered the bones could not shake the images that haunted their dreams, the whispers, the flickering shadows, and the voices of children singing hymns that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. They had unearthed more than just remains. They had unearthed the continuation of a darkness that had spanned generations. Dr. Margaret Thornton, the forensic anthropologist who analyzed the remains, confirmed what many had feared. The bones belonged to children aged between 8 and 16, their deaths spanning decades. It seemed clear that the creature that had once assumed the identity of Father O'Malley had continued its horrific rituals long after its expulsion from Sacred Heart. The fact that the bones had been arranged in geometric patterns and placed around a central chamber made it impossible to ignore the ritualistic nature of the deaths. The discovery of these remains, along with the chilling symbols carved into the walls of the basement, reopened old wounds in the community and reintroduced the painful truth that Sacred Heart had been a breeding ground for something far darker than anyone could have imagined. What had once been a place of faith and refuge had been twisted into a vessel for corruption and horror. Despite the damning evidence, the official records remained sealed, and the true extent of the evil that had plagued the Sacred Heart community was kept hidden from public view for many years. Even as survivors like Patrick Donnelly and Timothy Walsh tried to rebuild their lives, they carried the scars of their experiences, physical and psychological. Patrick, whose mind had been scarred by the manipulative and supernatural forces of O'Malley, struggled with seizures, memory lapses, and nightmares that would never fully fade. Timothy, though recovering more completely, was left with a stutter and a tremor that would forever alter his life. In the aftermath, the families who had survived the nightmare were scattered across the region, each carrying their own burden of shame, grief, and unresolved trauma. The town of Sacred Heart never fully recovered from the loss of innocence it had suffered. The church building was deconsecrated, sold to the county, and repurposed into a storage facility, but the damage had already been done. No matter how much the physical structure was altered or repurposed, the lingering spiritual contamination couldn't be erased. The supernatural phenomena that continued to plague the survivors of Sacred Heart further confirmed the existence of something far beyond the realm of ordinary understanding. Some families reported their children speaking in languages they had never learned, objects moving without explanation, and eerie whispers in empty rooms. These residual spiritual influences seemed to follow the Sacred Heart diaspora wherever they went, lingering long after they had physically escaped the church's grasp. Reports of similar disappearances in other Catholic communities across the Midwest, particularly in Wisconsin in 1867, only strengthened the theory that the creature responsible for the horrors at St. Joseph's Church was not finished. Though Father O'Malley's form had been exposed, the entity that had taken over his identity had simply moved on, continuing its predatory ways under new guises. This pattern of disappearances, strange rituals, and missing children continued, suggesting that the entity was persistent, adapting to new locations and assuming new identities within the clergy. In 1923, when the county courthouse was being built on the site of the old church, the discovery of the chambers beneath the basement, deeper than the original plan suggested, was the final blow to the myth of the church's innocuous past. The workers, after stumbling upon the graves and the ritual objects, fled in terror, forever marked by what they had uncovered. The presence of children's personal belongings from nearby communities, items arranged in ritualistic patterns, confirmed that the creature's reach had extended far beyond Sacred Heart. The workers who continued their shifts at the excavation site reported hearing whispers at night, a haunting reminder that the evil that had once claimed so many innocent lives was still lurking unseen in the shadows. The bones, carefully catalogued and analyzed, were given Christian burial in Sacred Heart's new cemetery, but the true story of their origins was never fully told to the public. The horrifying discovery remained locked away in the archives, with only the few brave souls who had dared to investigate knowing the full extent of the nightmare. The entity that had assumed Father O'Malley's form, an ancient malevolent intelligence, had wreaked havoc on the Sacred Heart community, and though it had been expelled from St. Joseph's Church, its influence had not been entirely eradicated. It had simply moved on, and the darkness it had left in its wake continued to haunt the people who had lived through it. A chilling reminder that evil once unleashed is often far more persistent than anyone could ever imagine. The most recent remains discovered beneath the courthouse site revealed a chilling detail. They were not ancient, but rather within the last 5 years, suggesting that the horror once thought to be confined to the 1850s at St. Joseph's Church had continued long after the church was sealed and abandoned. Dr. Margaret Thornton's report, filed with both civil authorities and the Diocese of Pittsburgh, recommended that the courthouse site be consecrated by proper religious authorities before construction continued. This suggestion was quietly ignored, but the eerie incidents persisted. Workers on the project spoke of tools moving on their own cracked foundation concrete that resembled the ritualistic symbols from the basement, and the haunting sound of children's voices singing when the site should have been empty. The courthouse, completed in 1924, served the county for nearly 8 decades, yet its employees reported unusually high rates of psychological issues, mysterious illnesses, and frequent job turnover. In 2003, after a series of unexplainable structural problems, the building was abandoned and left vacant until the renovation project uncovered the lead-lined box containing Bishop Kendrick's sealed documents. The true history of St. Joseph's Church, buried for over a century, was finally brought to light. This story serves as a stark reminder of the darkest truths lurking behind the most trusted faces. The 14 altar boys of St. Joseph's were betrayed not just by a monster in human form, but by a system that placed the reputation of institutions above the safety of children. The power of faith, unchallenged, allowed this evil to thrive undetected for years. The tale of St. Joseph's Church compels us to question authority, to remain vigilant, and to listen to the protective instincts that demand we challenge the uncomfortable truths we encounter. The entity that once masqueraded as Father O'Malley, was it stopped by the forces that exposed its true nature, or did it merely move on, continuing its predation in new communities? Perhaps the darkness was not fully eradicated. Have you ever encountered a situation where trusted authority figures demanded blind obedience, making you feel uncomfortable? What do you think? Did the evil finally end, or did it simply change shape and find new victims? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story chilling, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves unraveling dark mysteries. In the next video, we will explore another buried truth, one that powerful institutions hoped would never see the light of day. Thank you everyone for watching the video. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel to watch the next interesting videos.